Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. Someone just asked in the chat here when the lecture from this last Tuesday will be available on YouTube. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's good to know that at least someone noticed that. And I will make it available later tonight. So it will be available on YouTube. I will post the Tuesday lecture and also the Thursday lecture soon on YouTube. So yeah, welcome, Lauren. And Patrick just asked here in the classroom about the exam 1. And the answer is yes. Our first exam will be on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. So we don't have a face-to-face class. You can take the exam on Tuesday anytime between 1 p.m. and 8 p.m. As is explained in the syllabus, it's going to be on Canvas, and you're going to have 1 hour and 15 minutes to complete it after you started. All the instructions are available on Canvas.
How many questions is it going to be again?
50 questions. 50 questions, and then 0.4 points per question. So 20 points in total. The value of each, the number of points of each one of the 4 exams that we have, the 3 exams and the final exam, each one of them equals 20, which is the same of all quizzes together. Good? We, in the previous class, we were talking about population growth. Everybody can see the slide at home. I just cannot see I don't know why the chat is not appearing here. I'm sorry, 1 second. I'm just trying to make it appear. Oh, do we need to know how to use the equations from the lectures? Do we need to memorize every equation in the slides? No. The exams will follow the same style as the quizzes. The questions from exams follow the same style, so I'm not asking much about memorizing numbers and memorizing equations, more the definition and interpretation, understanding the trends. But it's good to know that the basic demographic equation is trying to estimate the population size in a specific time in the future based on a population, a specific time in the past, and the number of births and deaths that happen between these 2 times. So this is what I want you to understand. So the formulas, they're really straightforward in this sense. And we will be calculating stuff. If it's calculating things, will be more like I tell you how long time a population would take to double in size if the population growth rate keeps staying stable for several generations on 1% per year, the growth rate. 1% per year means a growth rate of 0.01. And we all know that the equation for doubling time is the log of 2 divided by the growth rate. What I can put in the question is like, oh, and remember that log of 2 equals approximately 0.7. So what you have to do is pretty much just divide 0.7 by 0.01, and the answer would be 70, right? So this is the kind of stuff that's important for you to know. But I don't expect you to use calculators or stuff like that. You can do everything just by hand and then answer on Canvas. I think I missed a question here. Will you post a review? All these slides that I have here in our course website since the beginning of the semester, they are pretty much a summary of all the content that we have in the textbook. So the slides themselves provide you an outline of the topics, and the lectures being available on YouTube, and I'm gonna post everything by tonight, they are, and if you wanna remember specific topics, you can just watch specific portions of the lectures, right? Equations, do we need to memorize every equation in the slides? No, we'll be calculating stuff, yes, but it's gonna be straightforward. All good? Cool. So I'm just not being able to see the, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to see the chat here so I don't miss any questions during the lecture. I think I have to open the chat after. Yeah, finally, sorry about that. Just technical issues always. So in this presentation that Hans, oh, sorry, someone is asking a question.
So we won't have lecture next Tuesday?
No,
Okay,
you don't need to come here face to face. So next Tuesday, there will be no face-to-face classes because all our quizzes and exams, they're taking straight from your computer online, and then you don't have to come to class. You can take it from anywhere. Another question? Yes, it's open book. That's why it's so easy. No, it's pretty much like you can look at your textbook, you can look at your notes, you can look at my slides, you can watch the lectures right before it, but there's that thing, it's like 50 questions. Once you answer one question, you cannot go back. It's just one attempt. So you can take the exam just once. And once you start it, it's 1 hour and 15 minutes. And the questions that will be randomly selected by Canvas to each one of the students will vary, right? But what I will do is make Canvas select randomly random questions for each one of the chapters that we are covering up until, to the topics up until the end of the class today, okay? We were talking in the last class about these changes in world population trends. And one of the things that Hans Rosling emphasizes a lot on this video is that the overall size of the population in the world is not expected to increase as much anymore as it has been in previous decades. So population projections that take into account the trends in fertility, mortality, migration, to kind of estimate what's going to be the size of the population in the future based on all this information that we have from historical trends and from the present. They expect that by 2050, the world population will increase to 9 billion people. Now we have around 7 billion people. And by 2100, it's expected to increase to 11 billion people. So overall, it's not increasing as much as we saw in those initial graphs from this lecture. What is going to be the difference is the distribution of this population by different continents. So right now, around 1 billion people live in Africa, and it will double to 2 billion, and then it will double again to 4 billion within these 50 years. So we're going to see a much higher overall number of people living in Africa, and of course, a higher percentage as well. The Asian population is still expected to increase, although they decline fertility a lot, exactly because they have some gains in mortality and people are living longer. You still expect to have an increase in population size, but then afterwards starts to stabilize, both in the American continent, in Europe, and in Asia. But Africa, exactly the country that has more issues of poverty and inequality, is the one that will have a huge increase in population size. So that's the challenge here. That's why there are so many social scientists concerned about the future population trends in Africa in order to implement policies now that will deal with this larger population size. But Hans Rosling also emphasizes not just the population size. If we implement policies now that train well this population here, first, we might actually decrease fertility more than we are expecting for these next years. And also, these people being more, having better educational attainment, they will tend to be more productive in the labor market, and will create more wealth to the countries in Africa, and that will be better for the population in the long term. So, and the other thing that he emphasizes in his text, in his video, is also that the overall number of people in below 15 years of age, or like the number of children, will not increase anymore. Will be around 2 billion children around the world. Maybe we are going to have more children, of course, in Africa than in Europe and in the American continent, because in those countries we have a decline in fertility. But the overall number of children in the world is expected to stabilize around 2 billion. And he used this term that the world reached this child peak, this overall number of children of 2 billion that will not increase much more than that in the future. What's going to happen is that we're going to have more children exactly in the countries that still have higher fertility than others. But what's expected to happen in the future is that exactly these people here in reproductive ages, they will tend to have the children in future generations, and they get older, they keep going into older age groups. So these people keep getting older and going to older age groups. The intervals here and the intervals within the age groups and the intervals between the years are not so correct. So I just use this based on what he was talking in the video, elaborated this table. But it's just to give you an idea that population are getting older, they are simply moving into older ages across time. Fertility is not increasing on average around the world. Fertility is not increasing. Some countries still have higher fertility than others. And exactly because mortality keeps improving, mortality rates are decreasing, you expect to have more people above the age of 75 in the coming decades, right? So you expect these people here to live a little longer, and they will account for 1 billion people. And this is a distribution of the projected 11 billion people in 2100 by age groups. So the world's population will continue to increase for the rest of our lives. Virtually all of it will take place in cities of developing countries. So the population will increase, but it's not going to increase in such fast pace as it was in the past, in previous decades. And we'll be around these 11 billion people, right? Based on all these historical trends that we know about fertility and mortality. And when I talk about projection of the population of the world, I don't have to take into account migration, because I'm pretty much just saying that the overall number of births in the world and the overall number of deaths in the world, how is that going to affect the population size of the whole world? I'm not taking into account, I don't have to take into account migration between countries. And this is just to show that this population increase is happening in different scales in different countries. So for example, we have India is expected to increase a lot. So the population will increase more than 90% between 2015 and 2050. Nigeria as well. The US is still increasing between 43 and 89%. So this is just a rough map, just to show that this red and orange countries here, they will tend to be the ones increasing population these next decades, while these other ones will tend to actually, like Russia here, is expected to have a population decline. The same thing about China, right? Cool. And, oh, I'm sorry. I'm correcting myself about this previous slide. This is not percentage. This is actual information in millions, right? So India and Nigeria will increase between 90 million and 338 million, each one of them between 2015 and 2050. The US, other African countries, Indonesia, will increase between 43 million and 89 million, each one of them between these years here, right? So that's the overall, that's the count. And Greenland and Russia, in this case, we see a decline in population. This is the percentage population increase. So here it's actually in percentage terms. So the overall population in India, it's increasing a lot. But since they already have such a big population, when you compare that number of people increasing compared to the size of the country right now, it's not so high. But in other African countries, it is. They are increasing, they're expected in size between 2015 and 2050, right? And that's exactly related to that table that I showed you before based on the video of Hans Rosling, that the countries in Africa, they are increasing a faster pace compared to their current population size. And because of that, they will have a higher share of the population of the world in these next decades, right? It has been hard for me to keep looking at the chat. I don't know, it disappears here from my window when I pass the slide. So if I don't see your question, please just unmute yourself and ask the question from home, okay? Thank you. And this is another graph to kind of show that the population is not randomly distributed across countries in the world, or even within countries. We see that most of the population in the US are more concentrated in the east half of the country compared to the western half. And in Mexico, population really concentrated around Mexico City. In Brazil, really concentrated around São Paulo and Rio. In European countries, since you have more decentralized resources in those countries, you tend to have a little bit more of a dispersion of the population. But you see in China, that's really clear how the cities around the East Coast, they have much more concentration of people than these other city, more rural areas of China. So whenever we look at these maps here, we are talking about the overall average for each one of the countries, but we have to consider that within countries, there is also spatial distribution. People are not distributed equally within countries in a specific time period, okay? And this is the 10 most populous countries in the world in millions here in 2015. So China had around 1.4 billion people and India almost 1.3 billion people back in 2015. And this is the scale that we project to have by 2050. So India will pass China, will be the most populous country by 2050, 1.6 billion people, and China around 1.4 billion people. And just go back, everything is related here. You see Nigeria increasing a lot in terms of absolute terms. And that is also linked in percentage terms. That's Nigeria here. And see, they're in the 7th place in this list, and they are jumping to the 3rd place, increasing from 183 million people to more than doubling the size of the population. They will have 400 million people expected by 2050. The US is still increasing because the total fertility rate in the US is still above 2 children per woman, is still above the replacement level. And also mortality is still improving, so the population is expected to increase. But overall, US is expected to have a smaller population size than Nigeria. And what you see here is that exactly the least developed countries are the ones who are expected to have bigger population sizes, like India, China, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Pakistan. Brazil also a mid-developed country, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Philippines, okay?
Is there anything in particular why Nigeria is going to have such a high growth compared to a lot of those other African countries? What stands out for them in particular?
So in the case of Nigeria, the fertility is still really high. The levels of fertility are high. And improvements in socioeconomic levels and overall life standard of the population has been really high in these previous decades. And that benefits declines in mortality. People live longer. Whenever we hear about Nigeria, we don't realize, but there are like even some sociologists and demographers showing that Nigerians in the US are one of the, children of Nigerians who immigrated to the US, so second generation immigrants. So if you have Nigerians coming from Nigeria to the US, and then they have children here, so Nigerian Americans who are children of Nigerian immigrants, they have really high levels of socioeconomic and education levels in the US compared to everybody else, compared to whites, compared to Asians, compared to all the African Americans, compared to everybody. I'm doing a study with another professor from the Sociology department, Dr. Sakamoto, and what we looked at Nigeria because exactly being a more wealthier country in Africa and the first language being English, we wanted to see if those people that immigrate to the US and their children, whether they're integrating better to the society. One first thing that we see is that actually the people who immigrate from Nigeria to the US, they already have higher levels of education and higher levels of socioeconomic status. So there is a self-selection in that case, that Nigerians that are coming to the US, they already have really good levels of socioeconomic and educational attainment. And that influenced positively their children, the integration of their children in the US. And that's also related to what's going on back in Nigeria, and that's related to your question, Patrick. It's exactly why do we have so many wealthier Nigerians coming here? Because exactly Nigeria is a country that has been developing a lot over time. Then mortality has been declining infant mortality rates. You start to have more children surviving beyond age 1, beyond age 5, beyond age 15. And that increases the size of the population in in a process in which fertility is still high. So let's just go back. This is a good question to go back here and talk about the demographic transition.
So with that being said, like I said, I was going to point out that next. If they're implying that death rate will be lower, is it also implying from Nigeria that their birth rate will also decline as well? Because like what we usually do is like longer lifespan usually means less children.
Yes.
And that takes it into account as well, correct?
Yes, but what's going on in Nigeria now is that, so the question was that you have a lot of like declining mortality, whether when people start to realize, hey, I don't have to have so many children anymore, I can have less children, and it's also expensive to have so many children, that will decline, but it takes a while to decline. So Nigeria and most of the African countries are still on stage 2, in which they have huge improvements in mortality, so mortality declines a lot, but it's still fertility is high. And then as people start to change their reproductive behavior, fertility tends to decline as well. So here you have in stage 2, that's the case of most African countries. In stage 3, that's where you see, for example, a lot of Latin American countries, right? That they have low levels of mortality, but fertility already started to decline a lot. And in stage 4, you have the more developed countries, such as Western Europe, US, Canada, Australia, in Japan, and so on. Is that better to understand? Yeah, so cool. Like this is a good point to show that Nigeria is right here, exactly because their mortality declines so much and their fertility is too high. You have this huge population increase over time, right? So Luis, I just saw your question now. So high populace is seen as a general negative thing? No, no. And that's the main message that I'm trying to pass here to you. That's why it's important to, like in the textbook, Dudley Poston highlights that, and those extra videos that I'm suggesting to you guys, I'm also highlighting that okay, declining mortality and still fertility is high, you're gonna have a lot of population increase, but if you provide good policies, a good education system to your population, if you think ahead on training that population for the future, when all these children, they enter the labor market, they will be really productive. Instead of working only in the primary sector and agricultural activities, they will work more in the industrial sector, in the service sector, and be more productive and generate more wealth to the population. This is easy said than what realities of all these countries are. All of them have political issues, have economic issues, and so on. But this is also related to that discussion that I did before about the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is that moment in a specific country that you're gonna see a lower proportion of children and older people compared to people in labor ages. So fewer dependents in relation to the producers. But if you don't take advantage of that moment, these people who are in labor ages, if they don't save enough money to their future, if they did not have good training earlier in their life, they will grow up poor, and when they get in older ages and retire, their earnings will go down. So demography, it's not, the main questions of demography are not only related to population size, and that goes back to the chapter 1. We are concerned about population size, we are concerned about population growth, population distribution, and then population composition, not only by age and sex, but a series of socioeconomic and education variables as well, right? And the distribution of the population on space is also important, not only between countries, as I showed in some of these maps here, those first two maps, but also the distribution within countries. Right? So all that is important to take into account. Well, what we are seeing is that countries in Europe, for example, and also Russia and China are expected to have a population decline. And the Chinese government, for example, is really concerned about that because they're going to start to have a really higher proportion of people in older ages who tend to be less productive of people between 15 and 64 years of age. And that will put a lot of pressure on economic growth in China. So the economy in that case in China is not being affected because they have an increase in population size. Actually, their population is expected to decline overall. But because they will have a higher percentage of the population in older ages who tend to be less productive, that will put a burden on the Chinese economy. The same thing about Russia, right? So it's not just the population size. In this case here, we're talking about countries that are going to deal with the issue of population decline. Why population decline is an issue? Exactly because you start to have older people who did not save enough money for their older lives, and they probably will be on having low socioeconomic status, right? Cool. So just going back, yeah, so this is the case of the 10 most populous countries. And this is just the Pew Research Center. It's a really well-known research center here in the US, and they conduct their own surveys. So they provide a lot of like interesting surveys related to the American society about demography, economics, politics, political behavior, and so on. But they also collect data from other sources, and they have always really interesting articles that's good for us to take a look in their website. And their website, if you Google it, you're going to find it, but it's also listed in our course website. And what you see is that by 2100, 5 of the world's 10 largest countries are projected to be in Africa, in Nigeria, DR Congo, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Egypt. Exactly countries that have lower levels of economic development and higher levels of poverty will increase a lot in population size. Indonesia tend to increase a little bit, but then as fertility declines, we tend to stabilize a little more. And the US losing a little ground, but overall, the countries that are kind of like growing, even in absolute terms, more with a more high intensity are exactly African countries. Cool. This next portion here of the lecture is optional, global population trends, and it's kind of related to the first chapter of our book, but it's also related to this chapter here. And this is another textbook. If you go to the end of this lecture, Wicks has this other book on Introduction to Demography, but we are using this one here. I mean, the content is kind of more similar, but the one that we are using has more in-depth analysis about migration and some specific topics, infertility and mortality, and is much more affordable as well. Now, the next chapter is related to, we will focus a little bit more on the case of population changes in the US. So, to talk a little bit about population change in the US, and I will list here 7 major demographic topics in the US that have been changing the American society in these last few decades. This chapter, it's chapter 13 on population change in the US, it also gives kind of like a historical analysis of how families and the overall American society changed from the time of colonization until now. But I will focus more on recent trends that we have been seeing in the US. And that includes being the developed country with the highest levels of fertility. An interesting topic and usually controversial topic is that by 2044, the US is expected to be a majority minority society. This term is pretty much saying that if you put together all the minority groups, if you put together in the US, all groups who don't self-identify as non-Hispanic white, and if you put them all together, and that includes Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, Native Americans, other races, and also those people that self-classify themselves as 2 or more races. So if you put them all together, these all minority groups together are expected to be more than 50% of the American population by 2044. But why is that a controversial topic? Because some of these people that are being called here minority groups, they are usually people, some of them, not all of them, of course, some of them are those who self-classify as 2 or more races, including being non-Hispanic whites. And maybe their background from their family, from their household, it's already wealthier than the other minority groups. So you are putting together a lot of minority groups that are really different from each other. I just mentioned to you a research project that I'm working on about Nigerian Americans. And Nigerian Americans, it's like they are a subgroup within African Americans who are doing better than other African Americans. And in some cases, they are doing as well in terms of socioeconomic and educational outcomes as whites and Asians. The opposite also happens. Among Asians, we usually hear that Asians have higher levels of educational attainment and socioeconomic status, but there is a lot of heterogeneity among them. For example, usually Vietnamese Americans have lower socioeconomic status than other Asian Americans, right? So by calling them all minorities and putting them together in a group and saying that they will be more than 50% of the population is simplifying the diversity of the US. But you will hear a lot this term that the US is going to become a majority minority country in these next decades. There is also changes of origin of undocumented immigrants. Most undocumented immigrants in the US historically, they came from Europe, from different parts of Europe. And then in more recent decades, the number of undocumented immigrants coming from Latin America and from Asia has been increasing. The country has been also experiencing increases in the ages at first marriage, decreasing percentage of persons getting married, increasing levels of cohabitation, and increasing percentage of births to women who are not married, okay? So these are overall trends in demographic indicators in the US. So we're just gonna talk a little bit about them now. So first, 1790 is the year that we had the first census here in the US. From the time of the first census until 2010, we are having the 2020 census right now with a lot of issues because the federal government is not providing enough resources to the 2020 census. But we have all this knowledge about the size of the population in the US increasing exactly based on the demographic census. And we're going to talk more about the demographic census why it's important and why it's actually collected in this throughout the whole course. And the chapter about sources of demographic data, we're going to talk specifically about that as well, because pretty much the Constitution requires that we count the population in the US in order to allocate the number of representatives that each one of these states will select in the House of Representatives in the US. So that's why it's so important. And in the Constitution, we mentioned that we are not counting just documented immigrants or documented or US born and undocumented migrants in the US. The Constitution reports that we should count the whole population. And that's the issue that we are facing right now in the 2020 census. The federal government is not given enough resources to have a high quality census being collected, but the Census Bureau is doing a great job and it's overcoming the issues. And that's what we are hoping for this next months of data collection. And this is just to show how the age structure in the US changed a lot in these last decades. So back in 1950, you still had a higher percentage of people between the ages of 0 and 4 years of age, so 0 to 4 children here, and then 0 to 5 and 5 to 10. What I like about these specific pyramids here, it has some interesting things that usually not all age sex structure graphs show for other countries. First, you see these dotted lines here, and you can read here. The dotted line indicates the excess male or female population in certain age groups. As we saw before, the sex ratio at birth is usually we have it's higher than 100%, so we have more boys being born than girls. So in younger ages, you tend to have more men, more boys than girls. So this is the difference between the number of boys and girls. And that difference tends to decline as boys and men overall, they have higher chances of dying than women. And then when you reach older ages, you start to see an excess of women, or more women than men in the society, in the American population. Another thing that we see here is that these groups here that go from 0 to 15, it's like pretty much the population of children in the US, you see they're a little bit like different color, they're a little lighter color. And the ones from 15 to 65 or 15 to 64, they're a little darker. These are people in labor ages. And then from 65 and above, little older, so that's the elderly population. So 0 to 14, 15 to 64, and then 65 plus. So it's just an interesting thing that with like a simple age sex structure graph for the American population, you can see already the differences here of men minus women, and here the same thing, women minus men. And also here you see clearly that the population of children was actually really high compared to other age groups proportionally, right? Here we're talking percentage terms in this specific graph. And as I mentioned before, the age sex structure can be either in percentage terms or in absolute numbers. And as the population starts to have declines in fertility and improvements in mortality, you start to see fewer proportion of children in that population, more people in labor ages, in little older ages, and also a higher percentage of people in elderly groups. So that's the population in 2017, and this is all data from the UN. 2050, expecting the population to get even older as the population gets older, mortality declines, and also fertility gets a little above 2 children per woman, but it doesn't increase as much. But you still see an excess of men compared to women, and that reverts because women live longer than men, okay? And this is the projected population by age and sex in the US by 2100. This is also a projection of the US population from 2014 to 2060. And in this case, broken down by nativity, whether people were born in the US, the light purple portions of these columns, and then the foreign-born population. So everybody who was born outside the US. If I get of the American population, okay, back in 2014, and it increased a little bit to 14%, and it's expected to increase to around almost 20% of the population, increasing from 42 million to 78 million, right? And this is just like dividing 42 million here by 318 million, which is the total of the population this specific year. You get the information in percentage term. This is also information about like mortality, why population increased so much in the US in this last decade, because people keep living longer. Mortality declined a lot. So the cruel death rate overall declined, but a better way to estimate and to understand declines in mortality, in other words, improvements in mortality, is to estimate the life expectancy at birth. Life expectancy at birth takes into account the chances of dying in each one of the 5-year age groups. It actually takes into account the chance of dying between 0 to 1, and then between 1 and 4, and then 5, 9, 10, 14, until 85 plus. And what we see is that people on average have been living longer in the US. And we're gonna discuss, I'm gonna show you how to actually estimate life expectancy at birth using this spreadsheet, or like this technique called life tables, that you pretty much just get the mortality rates by age group of a specific country in a specific year, broken down by sex, and then you can estimate the life expectancy at birth for each one of these years by for men and for women. And the life expectancy at birth has been increasing over time. And as we see, women always living longer on average than men, okay? This is an interesting graph, and I got it from Ruggles. I mean, he has a specific paper that he published that. He is a professor in the University of Minnesota, and he is the director of a research center called the Minnesota Population Center, MPC. And they have a project there called IPUMS, Integrated Public Use Microdata Series. So if you go to our course website, and if you just look for IPUMS, IPUMS, or if you just go to ipums.org, this research center, University of Minnesota, collects data, organizes data from the US, but also from a series of different countries in the world over time, and all this data there is publicly available. Right? Maybe it doesn't have like really refined information about number of people in specific smaller areas of geography, but it has a lot of information to be analyzed. And in his website, I mean, a lot of my research projects, we start by looking at the data in his website, and sometimes we even like, the whole project is based only on IPUMS data, and then afterwards we can refine a little more if we have access to other data as well. And in this specific article, and from 2015, and actually I follow him on Twitter, at least like some months ago, his profile picture was exactly this, this graph here. And he emphasizes in this paper that the type of families in the US have been changing a lot. The way that families are organized changed a lot between the 1800s and 2010. And this is for US couples between the ages of 18 and 64 years of age. So back centuries ago and some decades ago, the percentage of corporate families was high. What are corporate families? Pretty much those families are based on agricultural activities. So they would be small agricultural families producing for themselves and then selling products and interchanging products with other families in their community. In more recent, like around the 1900s, you start to see an increase in the percentage of families that have the husband as the head of the household. So these ones are called the male breadwinner families. So male breadwinner families started to increase their proportion in the society, in the sense that you had the family now not living in the rural areas, not based anymore their economy on agricultural production, but working on cities in urban areas, but it's still a much higher participation of men in the labor market than women. So a lot of these families had the men participate in the labor market and women working on activities in the household. And what you start to see in more recent decades, mostly starting in the 60s, is that now you start to see an increase on female labor force participation in the country. So both men and women of a specific couple between the ages of 18 and 64 start to contribute economically to the family. They both are working outside of the household, right? And bringing money to the household. Here, women were more working within, with a higher chance they were working within the household. And increased female labor force participation, you start to see an increase in female labor force participation and their contribution to the economy of the families. And you also see a significant increase on those families that pretty much have just the woman as contributing to provide resources, economic resources to the household. Those are usually households that have only the woman in the households without the partner. But it could be with the partner as well not working. He got upset. I mean, when I remember about this paper here and this figure, was like I think he tweeted, I don't know, some months ago, he gave an interview to that magazine, I mean, all online now, the Atlantic. And he mentioned that he was interviewed several times with several follow-ups about these changes in family composition and how families are now supporting themselves and where the money comes from to support the family. And he was saying that now you start to see this change, that both men and women are contributing women were contributing here as well, but they were doing activities at home that were not bringing money, but here they are now. And the article, if you Google the article from the Atlantic about family composition, it kind of like emphasizes that what we are doing now, we are pretty much failing as families, that the style that we had in the past was better. And that's exactly the opposite of what demographers have been saying. This is actually good because you're providing women the same opportunities in the labor market as men. Women start to do the same jobs, the same economic activities. Of course, there is a lot of income gap between men and women, even between men and women who do the same jobs, have the same levels of occupation, of education, same levels of experience. same age, you still see this huge gap, but the contribution of women and them entering the labor market is a positive thing, right? And this transition in how families are organized, it's a really interesting topic of study. So, and this is a major topic of study in demography and related to how families are organized, how families are composed in the US, okay? Or in the US and the whole world as well. And now I'm gonna go through those topics that I highlighted about major changes that we have been seeing in the American population. So the US overall has much higher levels of fertility than other developed countries. So France, Sweden, Germany, and Italy, Czech Republic in this specific case, they have much lower levels of fertility than the United States. All these countries, they have fertility below the replacement level, below 2.1 children on average by women. The US is still higher. And it's actually good that's still higher because then you have a more homogeneous size of children, people in labor ages, and older ages in the country. So still the population is getting older in the US, you start to see some pressure in the Social Security system, but exactly because fertility is not so low, the population is not declining in size, you don't have such a huge increase in the percentage of people in older ages. But you see a lot of variations. I mean, I was even reading an article explaining these huge variations here in Sweden. This is really related to economy. Like in their late 80s, early 90s, Sweden was doing good economically, so people get married, have more kids. And then Sweden started to have some issues economically, so people start to have fewer children. Here the data from Germany is just after the reunification of the countries, the East and West Germany, so it starts in 1990 probably here. So you still see some variation. In Italy also decline a lot, and it starts to increase a little bit. And we will look at this in the chapter about fertility, that a lot of people were concerned about fertility dropping a lot in those countries. For example, here, France, and also Italy, and also Czech Republic. But what some demographers are saying is that actually women, they're now investing more on their education in order to enter the labor market related to that previous graph. And they postpone the age in which they will have children. But after a while, after they finish their education, after they enter the labor market, get a job, then they tend to have those children in older ages. So by the end of their reproductive ages, they will tend to have on average similar number of children than previous generations. So this process of fertility declining because women are postponing having children to older ages, and then as they start to have children, the fertility bounces back up. This decline and then coming back is kind of like what we will discuss further in the course, the effect of the tempo on fertility. The tempo in fertility is exactly the time that women are having children in their lives. So women are postponing have children. In the short term, fertility declines, but then it bounces back as they start to have children, maybe not in the same levels as they were in the past, but higher than they were when they were younger. And then their daughters come right after them, having children also in older ages, so fertility tends to stabilize a little more. So that's why with all this variation in fertility, going up and down and much lower than 2 children per woman, usually what we expect is that the total fertility rate will be around 2 children per woman, which will replace pretty much the couple. And that's an important topic that Hans Rosling emphasizes a lot on his studies, on his presentation. Or he emphasized on his studies. Not that he's deceased, but it's all there, and we can see that he emphasized exactly that. People argue a lot about these changes in fertility, and those studies are important to understand the future population size and the future population composition. But overall, the total fertility rate tends to be around 2 children per woman, right? In the long term. But what's important here is looking at the US, among all these more developed countries, has the highest levels of fertility. And this is usually driven by higher levels of fertility among the Hispanic population, which again is a good thing for the country, so you don't have population aging in such higher degree as in other countries that are going to experience population decline and a higher pressure on the social security system. So immigration has this additional benefit to the country as well in terms of population composition. I mentioned the majority minority society. The US will be a majority minority society expected by 2040, which means that if you put together all people that don't classify themselves as non-Hispanic whites, they will be more than 50% of the country. In other words, we're going to have less than half of the country self-classifying as non-Hispanic white. But as I said, this is a little controversial because by putting together all these minority groups, we need to include African Americans, Hispanics, Asian, Latin Americans, other races, and people who self-classify in 2 or more races. We are putting together all these people that are really different from each other. Even, I mentioned before, even within African Americans, there is a lot of difference. Within Hispanics, a lot of difference. Within Asians. So this is just an oversimplification, just to say that this is just a way to say that the American society is diversified in terms of race ethnicity. But it's better instead of like using just this comparison size of non-Hispanic white on one side and other groups on the other side. It's more interesting to see the breakdown by race ethnicity groups, by different groups, and how they have different levels of fertility, mortality, education, migration, and so on. This is the percentage distribution of the US population by race and Hispanic origin. And this is data from 2014, and the lower bar, the projected population to 2016. The white population expected to decline to less than 50%. So adding together all these other groups, we have more than 50% of the population: African Americans, American Indians, and American natives, Asians, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islands, 2 or more races. Sorry about that. I mean, always these acronyms I get. It's hard to remember so fast. And here is just looking at the Hispanics. Getting all these groups here together, the lower bars here, they're expected to be around 56.4% of the population, right? So this is going from the Black to the Hispanics. Some these bars here all together, they are listed here. They were the minority back in 2014, and all together, the majority by 2016, expected to be by the majority, more than 50% by 2044. And Texas already has less than 50% of the population self-classifying as non-Hispanic white. So there is variation within the US, of course. Again, I'm saying this can be a controversial topic. Exactly, we are putting together here people with really different characteristics, really different fertility, mortality, migration, education experiences, okay? States that already reached this stage of being a majority minority country, majority minority state: California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Texas, and Nevada, and also the District of Columbia. 8 other states are now between 40 to 49 of minority groups all combined, and they will probably become majority minority. I mean, if you look at the data now from the data that will come out from the census, they might be already have less than 50% of the population self-classifying as non-Hispanic white. And this is just information by data from 2016. And to say the percentage of white population in Hawaii, District of Columbia, California, New Mexico, Texas, and Nevada already below 50%. And if exactly because of Hawaii, the native Hawaiians, much more diversity there, you have only 22% of white population. But in Texas already, 42% because of African Americans, but of course because of immigrants from Latin America over generations, you increase the population of Hispanic people in the state, okay? Texas already is a majority minority state. The non-Hispanic white population dropped below 50% already in 2004. And the demographic destiny of Texas is with the Hispanic population. And Texas will become majority Hispanic sometime between 2020 and 2030, within these next 10 years. And that's a different thing. Let's go back to the previous graph there, this one. Majority minority country, we are adding all these minority groups and putting them here. In Texas, what we are saying that within these next 10 years, you're gonna have Hispanics as being more than 50% of the population, right? And this is all based more on self-identification. When you have the census, the demographic census in the American Community Survey, people are asked, what's your race? And then you'll say white, African American, Asian, Native American, other race. And then there's a second question. Are you Hispanic or not? And then you combine these two questions in order to estimate the Hispanic population. All those that self-classify as Hispanic, doesn't matter the race. Doesn't matter if that person also self-classifies as white, black, or Asian. If that person self-classifies as Hispanic, they are in the category of the Hispanic population. And they are projected to be more than 50% of the Texas population in these next 10 years. And this is the projected population by race ethnicity in Texas from 2000 to 2040. And then you see the non-Hispanic white population declining in percentage terms from majority, 53% in 2000 to only 24%. And the Hispanic population increasing from 32 to almost 60%, expected to increase to 60% in 2040. The black population also a little decline from almost 12 to 8, and other groups an increase as well. Because the other groups include also, like I said, 2 or more races as well, which has been increasing. But even if you go a little deeper in Texas, you start to see variations across counties. So these are Texas counties with 50% or more of Anglo population. The ones in blue are counties with 50% or more of non-Hispanic white population. And they are declining over time. So the ones that are in white are the ones that have less than 50% of non-Hispanic white population. The ones in blue, which are expected from 2000 to 2040 to decline. And this is taking into account different scenarios in terms of fertility rates. Different scenarios that fertility can happen for the different race ethnicity groups. And in all of them overall, you have a decline in the non-Hispanic white population across all over the state. Of course, in these more central areas, you still have a higher concentration of whites, right? We have also seen changes of origin of undocumented immigrants. Until now, Mexico has supplied the United States with immigrant workers to fill low-wage jobs. And what we have seen, actually more recent years, is that a decline in the number of undocumented immigrants coming from Mexico to the US. And a major point that Dudley Poston, the author of our textbook, highlights is that he makes the hypothesis that because the number of undocumented immigrants from Mexico has been declining, because now the economy in Mexico is doing better, more economic growth, more economic development, people stay in Mexico, less of them come with an undocumented status, Chinese workers might be the ones replacing Mexican immigrants. And Chinese workers, they're pretty much a new influx of immigrant workers who will be fleeing hopeless conditions in China, and many of them will enter the US undocumented. Do Chinese workers enter the US undocumented through the southern border? No. They come through the airports, of course, usually with tourist visa, and they just overstay their visa. So if you say that you are really concerned with undocumented status of immigrants, you should not focus tax money, limited tax money, on the southern border, on border security in the southern border, but on having a better system to track people who enter as tourists and overstay their visas. We're going to talk about that in the chapter about migration. For those that like to use government money in a more efficient and wise way, spending money in the southern border with the argument that there are a lot of undocumented immigrants coming there, that's not based on facts. That's not based on reality. That's not based on science. And here is the foreign-born population whose residence 1 year ago was abroad, and just taking the cases of Mexico, China, and India. So these are people who entered the US from 1999 to 2000 is here, from 2000 to 2001 is here, and so on. And this is more recent trends. And you see that the overall numbers, and this is overall numbers, really not in percentage terms, has been declining from Mexico and increasing from India and China, okay? So I covered until the topic 3. I covered until here, changes of origin of undocumented immigrants. So both the quiz today and the exam on Tuesday will cover only until this topic here, the 3, on this chapter about population change in the US. Once again, I'm a little late on posting the quiz, so it's not there. I will post it later today. I will send an email when I do it, like I did last Tuesday. And the amount of time that I take to put it up there, I will give you extra time until tomorrow. And then on Tuesday, we don't have face-to-face class. You just have the exam. If you have, don't start taking the exam only really around 8 p.m. Try to take it really earlier, because if you have any problem with the internet or the system, just email me, okay? So thank you very much. Study, learn, be happy. Have a great weekend. Thank you very much.